guys, welcome to today's episode. I'm Candice Berlanga, certified feng shui practitioner, and of course, your host for the Learn Feng Shui podcast, where today ancient traditions will meet spooky living. We're going to be looking at a slightly spookier corner of feng shui and talk about the haunted house. So, if you've ever wondered why a home might feel off, or maybe why some objects need to carry their own energy, we're going to uncover some of these eerie examples today. So, we're going to look at what feng shui has to say about houses that might be holding more than just a memory, to haunted dolls, and even other objects that could also be haunted. All right, let's get into it. All right, guys. Well, each year I kind of recycle my feng shui and hauntings episode. This year I wanted to put some fresh energy up there, some fresh info. Today we're going to be looking at fengshuinexus.com and reading the article here entitled Three Feng Shui Rules Related to Ghosts and the Supernatural. It says here, a reader asked me what to do when there are diabolical entities in a house, and another messaged me about cleansing a house from ghosts and spirits. Although feng shui does not really have these solutions, some feng shui consultants who have this ability to sense otherworldly beings incorporate that into their practice. So I do understand why sometimes people think that feng shui is a spiritual practice, supernatural, or even religious. But in fact, some of us are looking at for feng shui consultants that have a special ability. It states here, I want to make it clear, feng shui is not about superstition or spirituality. Therefore, spiritual consultants are not part of classical feng shui. They belong to a separate body of skills and knowledge that only certain people are suitable for. I think he makes a really good point because if you were to call me and be like, I have a ghost in my house, I'd be like, I don't know why you're messaging me. I don't do that. And freaks me out a little bit. I don't have experience with that. It does take a special skill set. It says here, nonetheless, feng shui occasionally mentions about the spiritual world. In this post, I'm sharing with you three feng shui rules that have to do with the supernatural or supernatural realms, along with some tips of avoiding ghosts or the supernatural. The first one here is northeast and southwest are gates of the spiritual realm. According to some experts, the northeast corner, 45 degrees on the compass, is dubbed the outer gate of the spiritual realm, while the southwest, 215 on a compass, is the inner gate of the spiritual realm. These two corners are further said to form a straight line, dubbed the line of spiritual gates. I've heard this too. I've heard it actually called the ghost door. And what I learned is that if your home actually sits on the axis, so if your home faces exactly 45 degrees on the compass, if you go outside, you measure and that's the axis of your home, that you will be more prone also to hauntings, but also being more religious. So this is my interpretation of what I've learned. He states here, I haven't found explicit statement on what these gates are or what they'll actually do, but it seems that the northeast and southwest corners of the house are where natural realms meet the spiritual realm. And if these two corners are not dealt with properly, the home's occupants can experience bad luck. Article states that it's not suitable for a children's room. So, because the presence of these gates, some experts suggest that the northeast area of the house is not suitable for a children's home, especially if the children is under 8 years old, because their physical and mental strength has yet to mature. They're more prone to disturbances and influences than their adult counterparts. If kids under 8 have their bedroom in this area, they may frequently wake up in the middle of the night, disturbed or scared, and their sleep will be affected, and both their physical and mental growth will be negatively impacted. And one thing I can say is I had a client here, now that I'm remembering, her daughter's room was in the northeast sector of their home. And during the year of the tiger, which that's where the tiger sits in the northeast. Their child actually had their bed sitting there and they had a lot of issues, couldn't sleep, having nightmares. And so we shifted the bed over and it changed. So I think that could also be amplified when the Thai Sawyer Grand Duke visits that area for the year, if that makes sense. Let's see here. And the solution, it says, is simple. Just move your children's bedroom to another room, preferably in a favorable position for them. If that's not possible, try to avoid placing the bed in the northeast corner or of the northeast bedroom. And the same applies to the southwest. Not suitable for certain adults either. The area doesn't just apply to kids, but it also applies to some adults as well. When an adult is sick or physically weak, some experts suggest that the person should avoid both of these areas. This is because the spiritual realm contains excessive yin energy that can take away a person's yang energy. perhaps the same way of how we look at how a black hole sucks in light. The less yang energy a person has, the weaker they are, and I think this statement is mostly based on experience. Adults that are going through bad luck should avoid sleeping in this area. Again, it says it's based on personal experience. From stories that I've heard, a person would experience a lot of trouble when a ghostly spirit is following them for a variety of reasons. In a short period of time, they would get tired, robbed, have machines break around them, or get burdened with similar troubles. Only when they visit a temple or someone who has the sixth sense would they find out what is following them. It says it's also not suitable for floating objects, which you're not supposed to put water in the northeast sector anyway, because if you listen back to my episode about direct and indirect spirit, it doesn't follow that. So northeast is always a no-no. Southwest is fine. Just don't put it in the 215-degree area on the compass in Southwest, but Southwest is a good place to place water. Again, just avoid placing anything that floats. The statement comes from the idea that floating things or beings will attract spiritual entities. One of these floating objects are fish, therefore fish tanks for feng shui purposes are sometimes not suitable because of their swimming motion, make them seem as they are floating. Again, keep it away from the northeast anyway. There are some exceptions to the rules. That's not necessarily always the case, but just as a general rule of thumb, unless you have a feng shui expert place one there, I would just keep it out of there. Certain trees can bring yin energy. A few experts, mostly from Asia, broadly state that a weeping willow is just bad feng shui and should be avoided. Others go on to say it can cause great misfortune. In the Chinese language, they believe in what is called the homophone. That is when there's the same pronunciation of something that could mean something else, kind of like the way we could say damn and damn, right? It could mean like an expletive, or it could mean something stopping up the water from the river. So much the same way. So the character for willow has the same pronunciation as flow or leak because flow and leak are the same character. So that's why some say that the tree can bring loss of wealth because it symbolizes a leaking or flowing away of money. It says here that explanations using similar sounds are not legit. At least this person doesn't think so. But it's the same line of reasoning where the number 4 should be avoided because it sounds like death. It says here, I think this is pure superstition, and feng shui, of course, is not supposed to be superstitious. I agree with that. I like this article. What I somewhat agree on is that the willow tree attracts yin energy despite the fact that it's a form of life and belongs to the yang growing energy. The reasoning is because there's downward growth and the branches dangle whenever it moves. The movement mimics floating objects, like he mentioned earlier. Other plants that are said to attract yin energy include Bassano trees that crawl up on walls. I know they say ivy that crawls up on walls is not supposed to be good either. It says it's not suitable for residential feng shui, especially not in your house. There is also a saying that yin energy of the willow tree will be multiplied if it's right next to water. I'm not sure how this works, but I would suggest that we avoid these plants in your house altogether. There's no point in challenging these rules at your own expense. Speaking of plants from fengshuibalance.com, before I move away from this topic, a house surrounded by too many trees. Also, movie directors from ghost movies associate the place of happening mostly in a dark, damp, and unmaintained garden where shrubs and nature take over. The same can be said for any residential house where the landscape's taken over everything. As depicted in this image above that you can clearly see in the audio here, the structure is barely visible. Not only will there be limited light or yang energy entering the dwelling, but it also creates an extreme yin environment where moisture and darkness rule. We also should not forget homes that are located right in the middle of a forest surrounded by tall trees where the natural daylight is very limited throughout the daytime. It's an ideal setting to attract ghosts. It also says here houses too close to mountains. So if the yin energy, because mountains are regarded as yin energy, signifies the occupant's general well-being and personality. But if you live next to or even partially inside a hill or mountain, the house instantly takes up the distinctively yin characteristics of the mountain. Many Middle Eastern countries, graves are even built into mountains to intensify the yin energy. Back at Feng Shui Nexus here, kind of going back and forth. Graveyards and cemeteries. Obviously, this would create a yin energy. I'm going to say, though, before I start this part, I actually lived right next to a cemetery back in my younger days. I was a little bit limited on options for living, for a space. I faced a cemetery actually. And I never felt weird. I never felt like it was bad or anything. It was a very beautifully maintained cemetery. So I think it kind of depends. Maybe if I lived there longer, I would have experienced something. I mean, who knows? I really am not sure about that. But as a rule of thumb, it is very yin. Maybe my luck wasn't the best there now that I think about it, but I never had any paranormal experiences. It says these places are considered extremely yin because of the stillness and quietness of the place, along with the fact that there are dead buried in the area. These kinds of energies are spooky to some of us, and these energies are said to attract ghosts. Hospitals and retirement centers are similar because they are places where people pass away. However, their yin energy is not as profound as a graveyard or cemetery. How cemeteries and graveyards affect us differ by the individual. Some people who are more sensitive will get bothered by this place easily, and others who have the overwhelming yang energy, such as a young male, would not be bothered. There are also a few people who think living next to a cemetery is pleasant because of the quietness and ease of parking. Maybe that was me because I'm telling you, I hadn't read this article ahead of time. So I guess that answers my question, maybe. But I think it also depends on if it's maintained. I know we have an older city cemetery and it's not unmaintained, but it faces a park. And what I noticed is that the trees that they had there lining because it's just a chain link fence to the cemetery from the park and they close it off at night. I did notice that they trimmed all those trees and they made it look more open. And so it could definitely depend on the upkeep of the cemetery, in my opinion. The size of this graveyard or cemetery determines the strength of its yin energy. For instance, a large cemetery with one house could be adversely affected by its yin energies. Conversely, a small cemetery in the middle of a lively city would seem less spooky because there's overwhelming yang energies for those that surround it. And, again, that may be also the case because it was a little fourplex and there was a bunch of apartments nearby. And I actually lived kind of next to a little Mexican restaurant. That was actually my first job. So I liked the area. It wasn't bad. A little small. I didn't have a yard. Or else I probably would have lived there longer because I had dogs. That's just a little aside. Yeah, if you live next to a graveyard or cemetery, some experts suggest that you place a calabash on a side of the wall that faces the cemetery or graveyard. The color and the material of the calabash to be used differ by the direction where the graveyard is located relative to your house. And let's see here. However, I have my doubts on how well this works because is it really that simple? The best cure is still to avoid living too close to a graveyard or cemetery. There's other objects that are said to expel evil, such as the stone lions, which are the or the food dogs, and a bagua mirror that they carry in feng shui stores. Going back to fengshuibalance.com, it talks about land with a history attached to it. I've talked about this with my own husband and his family with their house that's allegedly haunted, has a lot of chaotic and just harmful, negative energy attached to it. So, yeah, it says here not that long ago, a local story made headlines with the family living in a normal residential home built in 2014 and started experiencing the unexplained. One night, the family was awakened by footsteps coming from the hallway. They got up to investigate, but found nobody there. The next night, they heard the footsteps again, but this time they saw a figure walking down the hallway. The figure was transparent and appeared to be dressed in old fashioned clothing. Over the next few nights, the family saw a ghostly figure more and more often. They began to hear strange noises and see moving on their own. The family was understandably frightened and didn't know what to do. Finally, they decided to call a medium that helped them communicate with the ghost. He concluded that the ghost was deceased in 1993 and was a fire victim who had previously worked at a toy manufacturing company. At the time, the factory took up the entire plot of ground in the residential neighborhood. Due to the building's bad design and locked emergency exit doors, many workers were actually trapped and killed when a big fire broke out. I guess OSHA wasn't enforced, or maybe because it wasn't in the US here. I don't know. A development company then purchased the land and constructed homes there. Seems legit. The ghosts were reluctant to depart since they had grown connected to the place. The medium suggested that the family hold a seance and try to convince the ghost to move on. So, all this to say that, again, when there is something negative that happens, one thing in feng shui, we do believe that the land can retain energy. A space can hold in onto energy. And when somebody has especially a violent or very shocking, scary, unexpected death, then what's gonna stay there? What's gonna hold on to it? So try to stay clear of places that have a history, even if the building is different. I That reminds me of actually around 2015. I can't remember the year now, but my husband had an apartment complex with 12 units. In a little plot downtown. Well, there was a fire. There it was cold. I think it was November, and he was in the middle of converting from gas to electric. So he had small electric units for all the units. And somebody I think didn't want to use the new electric heater my husband brought, so they actually used one of their old ones. Well, it shorted out and started a fire, and it completely burnt that complex down, and two people actually passed away, which, I mean, it was shocking. It was very shocking. But now nothing's sitting on that plot of land. We saw the plot, nothing's sitting there. It makes me wonder that if something is built there, what could happen? I think, and I could never talk about this on the news or anything publicly. So I'll tell you guys that it was actually located right next to a fire station, but they wouldn't, I'm just going to say it, they wouldn't help because they said it was out of their jurisdiction. They couldn't put the fire out. And so they had to wait for a different unit to come, leading to two people passing away. I mean, I don't know why I'm sharing this now, but I just thought that was crazy. Hey guys, y'all can, yeah, I could talk to y'all, right? But yeah, but again, if something's ever built there again, it makes me wonder what kind of energy that land is holding. If there's tragedy on the land, just be careful. I touched on this slightly back in May. I was a guest on the podcast called Deep Dive with Donnie Flamingo. I love his podcast, listen to it all the time. But we kind of talked about the topic of the suicide forest, right? And I haven't done a lot of research into this, but one thing I mentioned is that it's very, very dark and dim. Earlier, I mentioned the dark dimness, overgrown trees, overgrown plants, very Ian energy, as well as a history of tragedy. I mean, I think that's just a recipe for disaster. Going back here to the Feng Shui Nexus article, it says a note on figurines and statues. Some Feng Shui tips suggest that you place a statue or figurine somewhere near your house as a Feng Shui cure. Although these tips are sometimes considered religious and don't really belong to classical Feng Shui, I agree. And I also agree that he says that some statues can bring peace of mind. It also says, though, let me warn you that you should be careful when choosing statues or figurines. According to stories I've heard, if you burn incense, bring offerings, or pray to the statue, it can get enchanted. Once the statue is enchanted, spiritual beings can dwell inside. This, however, only applies to objects that have a human face. I'm going to say I am going to disagree with that because we're going to get into here in the Folklore Friday segment famous haunted objects, and not all of them have a face. I'm also going to just mention that one of the things that my feng shui master has taught us from our tradition is that you do have, when you pray to a statue or you pray to a deity and you have it on your altar, you are supposed to do what's called the open eye. And that does include, I would say, like he kind of says, enchanting it, right? You invite the spiritual being to dwell inside, and that's usually done by a priest. It says here the stories go further as to what kind of spiritual beings would live inside the statues. If you pray with evil intentions, evil spirits can reside and can bring you trouble. If you pray with devotion and compassion, blessed spirits will reside and can protect you. But if you abruptly stop praying or making offerings to that statue, it's said to become an empty house for the spirits. In other words, any other spirit can enter and reside there. It should definitely be avoided. This should avoid it because the presence of these spirits can take you through periods of bad luck, as mentioned earlier. That's why you should be careful with what statues you buy. And if you decide to buy one, especially from an antique store, it's wise to get to the bottom of its history. But if you're just buying a figurine off the shelf at a retail store, you have nothing to worry about. That's an amazing segue, a little transition into our Folklore Friday segment. We're going to be talking about famous haunted objects. Speaking of haunted energy, that brings us perfectly to our Folklore Friday segment. Throughout history, cultures have believed certain objects carry spirits or lingering energy, sometimes protective, like we mentioned, sometimes a little less friendly. All right, guys, we're going to explore a few stories of haunted dolls, statues, and other objects. From U.S. Ghost Adventures, the world's most cursed objects. Few things are quite as chilly as a story of a cursed object. Sometimes these objects are stolen artifacts or items with a mysterious past. In a previous segment, I mentioned that I don't think just objects with faces can be haunted. Let me tell you all a little story here. My feng shui master, we kind of talk about some of these topics in our feng shui class, and we have another master with us, and he talks about the kind of spiritual side and hauntings and stuff like that. He does the little segment for us in our learning that chapter for us. Well, he talked about one time how he had went to a client's house and they had talked about how they were experiencing some paranormal activity. But he said when he went into the kitchen, he noticed that from a secondhand shop, they had got an urn and they were using it to store rice in. So he had them take the object out of their house and it went away. There's definitely times where other objects can be haunted too. If you've ever watched the show The Haunted Collector with John Zaffis, I used to love that show. We definitely know that objects other than just statues can be haunted. From US Ghost Adventures, the world's most cursed objects. Few things are quite as chilling as the story of a cursed object. Sometimes these objects are stolen artifacts or items with a mysterious past. However, they can be simple everyday objects, which means that anyone could possibly come into contact with a cursed object. This terrifying legend of curses and hauntings have been passed down for centuries, and we're going to look at some of the most famous right now. What are the world's most cursed objects? It's no easy task that an item is the most cursed in the world. Some will point to the Hope Diamond, which is said to have killed multiple people with its ancient curse. Others are disturbed by James Dean Porche, which he was driving at the time of his death. I'm excited to talk about all that. And many believe it caused deaths after that. There's cursed items on eBay featuring items like the Dibbik Box, which hold a demon, and the hands that resist him painting, where the figures come to life. What is perhaps the most frightening about these cursed objects is that while many of them are safely tucked away in museums, others have disappeared and their fates are a mystery, which is creepy. Because what if that shit just pops up on you? I mean, I don't know. What if you see the Hope Diamond, which is our first one here? Known to be the most cursed of all the objects in the world, the Hope Diamond was allegedly stolen from a statue of the Hindu goddess Sita in the 1600s by Jean-Baptiste Travanier. Travanier stole the Blue Hope Diamond to King Louis of France, and it was eventually handed down to the other King Louis, who was beheaded during the French Revolution alongside his wife, Marie Antoinette. And the legend states that whoever comes into possession of the Hope Diamond is cursed by tragedy and death, while some others have suffered misfortune. Many argue over its authenticity of the curse today. Today, the Hope Diamond is safely ensconced at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. Although the Hope Diamond curse is said to have caused many deaths, some are more notable. Founder of it, Jean-Baptiste Travanier, died of a fever, and damn, the wolves ate his body? Okay. I didn't know I was going to have to give a trigger warning. Marie Louise, the Princess of Lambaye, after allegedly wearing the diamond for a time, she was captured by the mob, decapitated, damn, and her head was placed on a pike. Okay. Wilhelm Falls, he was a jeweler who recut the diamond. Wilhelm's son killed him and took his own life. Lynn Walsh McLean, who was an heiress who wore the diamond often. Her husband left her for another woman, and her mother-in-law died. Her son died at the age of 9, and her daughter overdosed at the age of 25. And James Todd, he was a mailman who brought the diamond to the Smithsonian Museum. His leg was crushed in an accident, and his house burned down. Damn, that's some pretty harsh stuff. Even the mailman, he was not immune to the Hope Diamond curse. All right, the next is a pretty famous one. The story of the Dibbik Box began in 2001 after antique dealers purchased an old wine cabinet, or what he thought was a wine cabinet, at an estate sale. Upon bringing the cabinet to his home, supernatural activity started to occur. Plagued by nightmares, the dealer learned that the cabinet was haunted by what was called a Dibbik. In Jewish culture, the Dibbik was said to be an evil spirit who terrorizes the living. I do believe that they actually told him not to open it, and they did warn him. It says, despite the cursed nature of the Dibbik box, a lot of people wanted it after the dealer listed it on eBay. It was eventually purchased by Zach Baggins of the Ghost Adventures for his haunted museum in Las Vegas. Rapper Post Malone was allegedly cursed by the Dibbik box after coming into contact with it on an episode of Baggins' show. After filming, he was involved in a car accident and his private plane experienced a malfunction, forcing an emergency landing. The original story is pretty interesting. I do recommend, if you are interested in spooky stories, you go through the deep dive of the Dibbik Box. It's pretty interesting. I remember the first time I heard it, I was very interested, although they do say now they don't know if some of that was just made up, but it lives in the Haunted Museum now. This is one I hadn't heard of, the Tallman Bunkbeds. So in 1987, Debbie and Alan Tallman purchased bunk beds at a secondhand store for their two children. After bringing the bunk beds home, the children reported seeing an old woman with black hair wandering around the room. Hell no. When Alan confronted the entity, it began to stalk him. Alan would see visions of fog and flames as well as hear disembodied voices. The children also claimed to see glowing red eyes. Even a local minister stated that the demonic possession was in the house. The demonic activity led to the Tallman's story being featured on 1988's episode of Unsolved Mysteries. The activity reportedly ceased after the Tallmans destroyed the bunk beds. I guess, dang, even your kids' beds could be haunted. That's pretty creepy. The Busby Stoop chair. And if you look at it, it's just a little wooden chair here. Again, I'll link this article in the show notes so you can take a look at everything I'm talking about. 1702, Thomas Busby was hanged for murdering his father-in-law, Daniel Auty. He was publicly executed next to the tavern he frequented and may have even had his last drink on the chair before dying. It was said that he put a curse on the chair where he usually sat, claiming that anyone who dared to sit there would die just like him. Over the centuries, several people died shortly after sitting in the chair, giving credence to Busby's curse. However, experts claim that the chair couldn't have been made in the 1700s and was likely not the original chair. In any event, the cursed chair hangs on a wall at the Busby Stoop Inn so that no one can be cursed by sitting on it. The Crying Boy painting in 1985, an article of a British newspaper titled Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy sparked a media frenzy. In the article, a couple claimed that the entire house burned to the ground with the exception of the painting of the crying boy. The article stated that since 1973, over 50 home fires have been reported, whereas the only thing to survive was one of these crying boy paintings. The original painting was made by the artist Giovanni Bragolini in the 1950s and was later mass-produced in England. Over 2,500 crying boy paintings were destroyed in the process, but many more still likely exist. Never heard that one. The Woman from the Limb statue. The Woman from the Limb is an ancient fertility statue carved from solid limestone, likely made around 3500 BC. It was found in Limb, Cyprus in 1878 after a man named Lord Elfont came into possession of the Woman from the Limb statue. He and his entire family died. That's a total of 7 unexplained deaths. The next 2 owners of the family also passed, and the final owner, Sir Alan Beaverbrook, along with his wife and 2 daughters, died after purchasing the statue. Beaverbrook's sons survived and quickly gave the statue to the Scottish Royal Museum. The statue continued its reign of terror there after a museum curator died. Oh my gosh. Since then, the Woman from the Limb has been safely stored behind glass and remains untouched. They're smart for putting that behind bars. Next, the Black Orlov Diamond. The Black Orlov Diamond is said to have been stolen from India by a monk. The diamond is part of a statue of the Hindu god Brahma, giving the stone the alternative name, the Eye of Brahma diamond. It is said that whoever owned the diamond will jump to their death. I sense a theme here with cursed Hindu stones, so do not ever take a stone from a Hindu deity. In 1932, a jeweler brought the diamond to New York where he sold it, and after that, the jeweler proceeded to jump from the top of a skyscraper in Manhattan. 1947, a Russian princess who had previously owned the diamond jumped to her death as well. This happened a third time with yet another princess who owned it. All that is known of the Black Orlov Diamond now is that it was sold to an anonymous buyer in 2006, so that's still out there. Another one that's remained a mystery and is still lost is James Dean's Porche 550 Spider. In 1955, the famous story is, of course, James Dean tragically died in a car accident while driving his 550 Spider. He nicknamed his car Little Bastard and had been driving it to a race when the crash occurred. A week earlier, famously, actor Alec Guinness, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi, had warned Dean that there was something evil about the car. The engine and transmission from the Spider were placed in 2 different cars, both of which crashed. The driver of the second car perished in an accident. After that, the spider went on tour, later catching fire in a garage and then later falling on an unsuspecting bystander. That reminds me of that car, Christine. Y'all remember that movie, the Stephen King? No one has seen the spider for 60 years. So the story of the car and the curse remains a mystery. And Zach Baggins purchased the transaxle of the infamous car, which is displayed in his haunted museum. Lots of Zach Baggins references here, but again, he does have a lot of stuff, and this is a Ghost Adventures website. The Bassano Vase, a legend of the Bassano Vase goes back to 15th century Italy. The story goes that a bride-to-be was given a simple silver vase, and when no one could find her for the ceremony, her future husband went searching for her. He found her dead holding the vase in her arms. A family member inherited the vase quickly after, and they passed away after the third time. A priest had buried the vase on hollow ground. However, it would eventually be unearthed. 500 years after the bride's death, someone dug up the Bassano vase and the curse continued. The police officers eventually buried the vase in a cemetery and it hasn't been seen since. There are multiple variations of the Bassano vase curse, but still the most told version. So it's kind of one of those things where they don't really know if it's true. When I first started learning about creepy stuff, the Hands That Resist Him painting was a very famous in 1972 by the artist William Stoneham. The Hands Resist Him painting gained prominence when it appeared on eBay in 2000, and the owners claimed that the painting was haunted and they needed to get rid of it. The painting was viewed hundreds of times and sold for around $1,000. The Hands Resist Him is a bizarre painting featuring a young boy next to a girl with hollowed out eyes. Behind them is tiny hands pressing up against a glass window. According to the owners, they purchased the painting at a garage sale and put it in their child's room, which is, I mean, I wouldn't have done anyway because that thing's creepy. If you want to look at it, go ahead. But allegedly, people said that they even have experiences after even looking at the painting online. So I'll leave that up to you. I looked at it. I'm not very superstitious. I looked at it, creepy, but never had any hauntings. Also, they say if you listen to the story of the Dibbik Box, sometimes if you do the deep dives, I'll warn you about that one too. That some natural things may happen just by knowing about it. They say if you look at the paranormal, it looks back. So I don't know. Never had anything happen. I've been looking at this stuff for years. Let's see here. After they strangely put it in their child's room, this creepy ass painting, a child complained that the children in the painting would fight and a little boy would climb out of it. The painting's also associated with the death of 3 men. The Hands That Resist Him is currently owned by a gallery owner in Michigan who bought the painting back in 2000. I'll also add that I remember when looking into this story, I think my sister is the one that brought my attention to it, that they got cameras for the room after the little boy was saying that the kids were fighting in his room and it scared him. So they got a camera and you can see motion in the picture, which is creepy. No, thank you. Okay. So just be aware of cursed objects. One thing that they didn't mention was the dolls. There are plenty of cursed dolls. I'll just quickly go over a few of them here. Also from US Ghost Adventures. Real Haunted Dolls, Annabelle, Robert, and Lily. So Lily the doll is rooted back to the 17th century when practitioners of the occult used handmade figures to fend off spirits and vicious ghosts. The original Lily doll was a creation of Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian blood countess who bathed in the blood of virgins. The doll captures her vile appearance and wards off other hauntings, but probably not hauntings by the doll itself. It says Lily arrived at the Ghost Adventures office in a little wooden coffin with a note attached that said, "Please help." So it says here, Lily, from what we deciphered, was the original doll used by occultists years ago. Lights flicker in her mere presence and strange odors are said to follow her. Robert the doll is another famous haunted doll. And of course, if you don't know the story here, he resides in Key West, Florida. You have to ask permission to take pictures of him. The origins of Robert the doll are still a matter of debate, but it was believed that the toy is from Germany and gifted to young Robert Eugene Otto in 1904 by his grandfather. There's no indications of where the darkness within the doll could have come from, but other versions state that a maid for the Otto family gifted the doll for the boy and hexed it to get back at her employees for unknown reasons. Early 19th woman of color. Was she being demonized or was she being mistreated? Who knows? Could be either with this time frame. Whatever the story is, Robert and the doll and Robert the boy became friends and it wouldn't take long for the normalcy in the Otto household to be shattered. It did say the closer Robert grew to the doll, the more volatile the relationship became. Unexplainable activity started. I know people will say that they would see the doll peeking out the window at them. Most of the activity was Robert the doll just leaving a mess of destroyed toys and overturned furniture. Even outsiders took note of the eerie activity, saying they could see things moving around on their own from outside. Again, they would see him sometimes. Misfortune also followed him, car accidents, dissolve relationships, sudden illness. Only by asking Robert the doll for forgiveness could you be free from the grip. Again, he does reside under lock and key in the Martello Museum in Key West. It does say he still dishes out mischief to anyone who disrespects and fails to apologize. Of course, Annabelle the doll, we know her from all the movies, but she is actually a Raggedy Ann doll from the 1970s. It was purchased for a girl named Donna from her birthday. Donna and her roommate Angie would both become victims to Annabelle's antics when she started moving around the apartment on her own. Doll's wrath was mostly focused on Donna's friend Lou, who was uneasy around its presence. Things escalated when Annabelle physically assaulted Lou, scratching him and trying to strangle him. The famous case of the paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren deduced something inhuman and dangerous and evil inhabited the doll, and of course took it to be contained at their museum, the Occult Museum. It was closed due to zoning issues. Ed and Lorraine were not immune to this. The Warrens also experienced a tragic car accident after trying to perform an exorcism on the doll. It does still reside at the Occult Museum and was recently purchased. Annabelle famously went on tour, was lost for a little while, and said to cause havoc. I don't know if the activity that followed her tour in the States could kind of attribute anything to that, right? So, on another note, Raggedy Ann dolls are super creepy. I also remember hearing a story quite some years ago. Y'all remember that paranormal.about.com website that used to be out there? I used to spend lots of time reading on that. And there was one story where a lady who collected Raggedy Ann dolls was reported to be cooking in her kitchen. Her husband comes home. He sees a new life-size Raggedy Ann doll as he enters with the collection, and he kind of mentions to his wife, "Oh, it's a nice doll. Like it's really, really big, nice, whatever. Where'd you get it from?" And she was like, "I did not buy a new doll today." And when they went to go look, the doll was gone. So I have a little bit of a creepy relationship with the Raggedy Ann dolls too. I think they're a little bit creepy, although we do have one that's Christmas themed. I think it's like the 100-year anniversary Christmas doll. We bought it from Cracker Barrel though, so no hauntings in that one. And then last but not least, Okiku. A Japanese curiosity may have you checking the length of your doll hair in your own home. Okiku's legend begins with a teenager who purchased the Japanese doll for his 3-year-old sister, Kikuko. It is a simple act of kindness between siblings. Nothing was truly remarkable when she received it. It was only after the young girl's sudden passing from a cold that the aura crept around the doll. So poor Kikuko loved it all and was often seen carrying it, so it's not unthinkable part of her would remain attached to the object. The longer the family held onto the doll, the more they realized that the hairstyle had been growing, an impossibility for an inanimate object. They immediately believed the sweet girl's soul was attached to the doll. They kept the doll for themselves, feeling connected to Kikuko's spirit. Years later, though, they decided to move from Hokkaido Island where they lived, and they entrusted Okiku to a temple of monks. The doll and Kikuko's spirit remained at the temple ever since, drawing curious travelers to see the impossible flowing locks. It does state here, if you listen to some versions of the doll's legacy, you'll hear that the hair continues to grow to this day and has been tested and scientifically proven to be real human hair. All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you hear a creaking floorboard, an oddly placed statue, or a doll that seems to watch or move on its own, you may have a haunted object. Who knows? Remember, every haunting and every haunted area has energy, and even with awareness, sometimes you can balance your space, bring it back, trim those trees. Don't clutter your space with a lot of stuff, make it overly yin, and be cautious of moving next to a cemetery. All right, guys, until next time, keep your objects cared for and maybe in this spooky season, keep one eye open.